My name is Aaron Ray. I'm Assistant Director for Energy Innovation in the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. I really appreciate the invitation from Kirby and the planning team to come speak with you all, and it's always nice to get out to the West Slope at this conference every year. It's a really fantastic opportunity to connect with people and learn about what's happening around the state. I was invited to talk about Colorado's greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap, and I want to start by noting that while I'm working at the Department of Natural Resources, and we played a key role in putting this document together. It was much bigger than DNR. It was an effort that involves nearly every state agency and a whole host of stakeholders from around the state. And so I'm going to speak to how that document was developed. I'm going to focus particularly on some of the energy development elements of that roadmap, but there's much more to it than what I'm going to share with you today. So why did we create a greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap? The short answer is because we are required as state agencies by state law to help meet these greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, which were created in 2019, updated in 2023, and they set greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets for the entire state, so not just oil and gas, but all sectors. And you can see that those targets are 2026 reductions by 2025, 75% by 2040, and net zero by 2050. Those are ambitious targets. We've made progress, as I'll show you in a minute, in meeting those early targets, but there's a lot more work to do, and that was the reason for this updated greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap. So the first roadmap was released in 2021, and that was intended to help us meet those initial targets. As of 2024, we had implemented about 95% of the actions that were in that first roadmap. And so in 2023, we were looking at the fact that we had started or completed most of the work that was outlined in the first roadmap, and we now had updated targets set by the state legislature. And so we realized it was time to update that first roadmap to reflect the work that had been done, the new targets, and the additional work that would be necessary to meet those new targets. And so starting in 2023, state agencies got together, looked at what had been accomplished, looked at what the new targets were, and started to brainstorm what additional work could be done to help us meet those targets that are in state law. And so that work started in 2023, continued into 2024, and in February of 2024, the Roadmap 2.0, the updated state roadmap, was published. The process to get there, though, involved really significant public engagement. So as state agency staff, we had in-person meetings in every region of the state. We had numerous virtual meetings with the general public, with a whole host of stakeholder groups, including the oil and gas industry. And as I mentioned, by winter of 2024, released that roadmap. It's available on the Energy Office's website. But one of the things that we heard in that stakeholder engagement process, as you can imagine, was a lot of competing priorities. And so part of the challenge in putting together any kind of document like this is how do we meet the mandate from the legislature while also reflecting diverse perspectives? People that wanted us to move more quickly and reduce emissions faster, people that, as you heard this morning, feel like these activities are creating burdensome regulation. And so one of the challenges for us was how do we weave all that together into a document that achieves the mandate that we have from the legislature. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of those dynamics as we move through this. So one of the things that we looked at the start of the process was what had the state already done prior to updating that new roadmap. And so some of the major accomplishments prior to the new roadmap were things like creating binding plans for utilities to reduce emissions from electricity generation, investing at the state level in the transition to electric vehicles, opening the state's Office of Just Transition to help communities primarily that would be affected by changes in coal production and use, adopting regulations on a variety of sectors to reduce emissions, creating the Environmental Justice Unit at CDPHE that now informs activities all across state government and how do we implement these actions in a way that reflects our environmental justice priorities. So as we inventoried what had been done, the question was, okay, what's next? What do we need to do given that our targets continue to get more stringent? These things will continue to be implemented. They'll continue to have benefits, but there was more work that was going to be necessary. And part of the process was looking at the data on our emissions, both historic and projected. And so this is a graph that you'll find in the roadmap document. And I want to spend just a minute here because I think it's important framing for where we are. The dotted blue line shows historic state greenhouse gas emissions starting in 2005 and running through 2020. And what you can see is over that period, emissions have generally trended down in the state. That's good news. 2020 was sort of the start of the projections. So you can see three solid lines there. The blue solid line is what's called the business as usual scenario. So that assumes no new action since 2020. What would emissions look like in the state if we didn't do anything else? And you can see that you get continued emissions reductions through about 2030, and then that line levels off. The challenge is the red stars are our statutory targets, right? That's what we're required by state law to achieve. And so you can see if we do nothing, we're not going to meet those targets, and that's not really a surprise. The next set of projections was that yellow line, and the yellow line was if we do all the things that were in place as of 2024, so the accomplishments I just showed you on the last slide, and we assume the continued implementation of federal policies and programs that were in place as of 2024, you get that baseline emission scenario. So steeper reductions through 2030, and then a tapering off of those reductions after 2030. That's better from a greenhouse gas emissions reduction standpoint than the business as usual scenario, but you'll note that the yellow line still doesn't get us to our statutory targets, right? It wasn't enough to lean on just what was in place as of the beginning of 2024. And so the updated roadmap includes 49 new, what we call near-term actions, and those are new steps the state could take to try to meet our statutory targets. And that's reflected in that green line. So you can see that the green line gets us closer, although not quite all the way there, gets us closer to our 2025 and 2030 targets if all of the actions in the roadmap are implemented, and importantly, given political changes at the federal level, if policies and programs in place at the federal level were continue to be implemented, and that's a big source of uncertainty at this point, the state is pretty confident that we'll get relatively close to meeting our 2030 targets. You can see the line, again, emissions reductions slow after 2030. And so part of the concept of this roadmap is we've got intermediate targets we need to hit. We know that there's more work that's going to be needed. These actions aren't going to get us to our 2050 target. And the real challenge is getting to that 2050 target is going to be really hard, right? We're doing the easy stuff first. It doesn't feel easy for you. It doesn't feel easy for us. But the challenge is it's going to get more challenging as we go along. But that also gives us lots of time for innovation, for a whole host of things that we can't plan for at this point that we'll have to address in the future. So I mentioned 49 new near-term actions. They cover every sector of the state's economy: utilities, transportation, buildings, oil and gas, as you all know, industry, agriculture. And I'm not going to try to go through all of those 49 near-term actions. I'm going to focus specifically on those that I think are of most interest to this group that are really around energy development, and in particular oil and gas. One of the first things that the state is doing and has been doing is trying to promote a transition to renewable energy generation to help reduce emissions from electricity generation in the state. We have a goal to get to 100% renewable energy for electricity generation in the state by 2040. And so one of the pieces of direction from the roadmap was to DNR to expand renewable energy generation on state lands. State Land Board manages about 2.8 million acres of state lands. State Land Board is currently generating about 10% of Colorado's renewable energy. Important to note that we can generate that much renewable energy on only actually less than 1% of the land that the State Land Board manages. So there's lots of discussion about the impacts of renewable siting, and that's a critically important conversation. But this is an example of where we can get really important benefits, not only to our emissions reduction, but also revenues that support public education using a really small fraction of the lands that the state manages. But there was a direction to increase that generation from what is today about 600 megawatts to about 750 megawatts by 2028. And so the State Land Board is really focused on how do we find the right places to put that generation on state lands that helps meet this target, but also generates revenue that supports public schools and minimizes the impact to other uses of state lands like agriculture, conservation, recreation, wildlife, et cetera. Related to that, we know that state lands aren't going to be enough in terms of renewable siting, and so there was also direction in the roadmap to the state to think about how do we modernize clean energy siting in the state. And some of the folks in this room will be aware that there was a process last year to think about what would that look like, and that ultimately led to a piece of legislation, Senate Bill 24-212, which was signed into law last year, that maintained local government authority to site renewable energy projects, but provided additional state resources to help support local governments in that process. And so Senate Bill 24-212 directed CPW to provide resources related to high priority habitat and best management practices, directed ECMC to support local governments in developing codes if local governments want to do that, in reviewing individual projects, if local governments want help reviewing projects. And so we've been adding capacity at both CPW and the State Land Board to do this work. There was also a study that's required by Senate Bill 24-212 that the Energy Office is leading, and there's been a stakeholder engagement process around that study. We expect the first draft of that study will be available to the public and to stakeholders to review this summer. So for folks that are interested in this process, we would love your feedback on how do we do a better job of putting renewable energy in the right place in the state. Another piece of direction was around carbon management. So we need to reduce emissions, but in order to get to net zero by 2050, we're also going to have to do something about places that are hard to decarbonize. Think of steel and cement production, other sectors of the economy that are just very difficult to eliminate emissions from. And so we think that carbon sequestration and carbon management will be a complement to our emissions reductions goals. So there was direction to DNR to pursue a regulatory framework for carbon management to ensure that we're doing it correctly in the state. There's been legislation in the past couple of sessions to do that. ECMC adopted regulations for what are called Class 6 carbon sequestration wells earlier this year. That will form the basis for the state's primacy application to the US EPA so that ultimately Colorado can start regulating these wells here in Colorado rather than having the federal government regulate them. We think that's better for the state. And so we're optimistic that there will be a role for carbon sequestration here in Colorado. I'll also note that we got feedback in the stakeholder process that said the state should just phase out oil and gas permitting, right? And we've heard comments throughout the week here about concern that that's the ultimate goal, is just ending oil and gas production. And I want to be very clear that that was not the approach of the roadmap. The roadmap was focused on reducing emissions associated with a whole host of activities, not just oil and gas, but explicitly was not about phasing out production. And so one of the ways that we're trying to do that is CEPHE is responsible for greenhouse gas intensity targets for oil and gas production. There was direction on the roadmap to continue to implement those. And I'll note that in the cumulative impacts rulemaking that you heard about yesterday, ECMC incorporated into those cumulative impacts rules reference to the greenhouse gas intensity targets that operators are responsible for. So we believe that it's possible to continue to produce energy here in Colorado in a progressively cleaner way. There was also interest in using some of the infrastructure that already exists, right? And so there was direction in the roadmap to study alternative uses of oil and gas wells. So operators in the room will know that when a well comes to the end of its life, you're obligated by law and rule to plug and abandon that well. One of the questions was, what if we made use of that infrastructure that's no longer economical for operators to use to produce oil and gas? What if we make use of it for other purposes? And so ECMC is studying regulatory changes that would allow operators to convert those wells to geothermal or carbon sequestration or gravity energy storage or hydrogen production. The idea is we've already got the infrastructure. Let's use it for a productive use. And so we've been having conversations with folks in industry that are interested in doing this. if there are any of you in the room who are interested in these kinds of things, please speak to me or folks from ECMC. We'd be happy to talk to you more about what those opportunities look like. There was also direction to try to reduce methane emissions from landfills and coal mines. I won't speak to the landfill piece. That's a CDPHE responsibility. But at DNR, both ECMC and our Division of Reclamation and Mining Safety have a role in regulating coal mine methane capture. We think that's an opportunity, again, to take a resource that's escaping to the atmosphere, that's contributing to climate change, and we can put it to productive use, or at least prevent it from being emitted to the atmosphere. And so ECMC has adopted a policy to enable that kind of work in collaboration with DRMS and CDPHE. And we think that there are more opportunities to capture some of those emissions that are currently just being wasted. Finally, there was direction to consider a strategy for what we called net GHG neutral oil and gas development. And I want to emphasize that this was considered as a voluntary program. That's the intent. It's not something we've spent a lot of time working on yet. We've been working through a whole bunch of other things. But it's something that we've heard from some folks about as an opportunity for operators to be able to exercise a competitive advantage, right? If there's a demand for oil and gas that have lower emissions footprint, we could help at the state level give you the opportunity to be able to market a resource that way. This is, again, something we've not started on. We would love to talk to folks who are interested about what this might look like, again, as a voluntary program, but it's something that we got direction from in the roadmap. So with that, I will stop. We've got just a couple of minutes for questions. Be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yeah.
My name is Matt Solomon with the Northwest Colorado Energy Initiative, and I have a question for clarification, if you don't mind. Recently, there was a late bill proposed by the governor and the Energy Office proposing we move the deadlines forward from 2050 to 2040 for our 100% goal. And I'm looking at the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Reduction Roadmap, which is Colorado's ambitious plan, and it says currently our goal is to reach 100% by 2050, but you just cited 100% by 2040 as the current goal. So are you referencing the proposed late bill? Are you pushing that agenda, or was that a mistake? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to clarify that. I was not referencing the proposed bill. That's not a bill that the Department of Natural Resources has a role in, so I'm not going to speak to that legislation. My reference to 2040 was specifically around reducing emissions from electricity generation. So the GHG roadmap is economy-wide emissions reductions. And the goal in the roadmap is 100% emissions reductions from 2005 by 2050. The governor has a goal of getting to 100% clean energy on the grid, so just electricity generation, by 2040. So that's a piece of this broader goal, but separate from the roadmap and separate from that bill that you referenced. Thanks for the clarification. Other questions?
Hi, Courtney Taylor with Rimble. It was really wonderful to see the plot of how we're projected and on track with our targets or not as you look further ahead. I'm wondering if there are opportunities for this group to collaborate more with other biogenics, uptake and sink of carbon to get more of those long-range forecasts and to bring those future forecasts for 2050 down.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There's a lot that I didn't include here, but other forms of carbon management beyond geologic sequestration, which is the piece that I spoke about, are certainly part of the state's goals. The State Land Board, as I mentioned earlier, is very interested in managing state lands to provide for biologic carbon sequestration. The State Forest Service is looking at how do we manage our forest resources to sequester more carbon. So there's lots of interest in that. And other forms of carbon management, and be happy to talk more about that. There was another roadmap. We love roadmaps in Colorado state government. There was another roadmap released just a month or so ago, the Carbon Management Roadmap, again, based on direction from the legislature, which talks about all the forms of carbon management that we think might be possible here in Colorado. So happy to talk to you more about that if you're interested.